Shipley is 5'11", which is 57th percentile for height, 206 pounds, which is 28th percentile for weight. He ran a 4.45 40-yard dash with a 4.1 shuttle and a 6.88 3-cone. And then overall, he had a 9.57 relative athletic score, which you might have seen other places. It's slightly different. In Jonny's article, it was 9.61, and that's just because relative athletic scores shift every time somebody else tests. But 9.57 is his most recent number that at this point shouldn't really change until testings happen next year. He had some of his stats in the last 2 seasons. He had 40 targets each of those 2 years. So he's a guy that was utilized out of the backfield a lot at Clemson. He was 95th in yards after contact per attempt. And these rushing stats are going to be among players with 100 or more rushing attempts last year, which is 153 guys. So he was 95th out of 153 in yards after contact per attempt. He was 118th in missed tackles force per attempt, 35th in breakaway run rate, which is a breakaway run is a run that's 15 or more yards. 9% of his runs went for 15 plus yards. Per PFF, he was a terrible pass blocker with pass blocking grades of 33.1, 20.3, and 27.6. He was 11th among running backs in snaps out of the slot at 16.9%, and he was 52nd in yards after catch per reception at 8.8 yards, and he was 70th in drop percentage at 9.4%. So you look at the stats, Shipley was a guy that was used out of the backfield a lot. He was used in the slot, not particularly elusive, doesn't really get yards after contact, but just kind of a steady, semi-reliable player. And so, Jonny, you've got an article up on Bleeding Green Nation that everybody should go read, but you broke down some film. There's some clips in there, but before we get to clips, what was just your general impression watching Shipley? What are some of his biggest strengths?
Yeah, so the good news is you can't lie when you watch someone pre-draft and rank them for Bleeding Green. So I wasn't the biggest Will Shipley fan, so I can't lie post-draft. I didn't hate him. I had him like round 4, round 5, which is basically where the Eagles took him. It's just like philosophically, I want explosiveness out of backups rather than like, I mean, we use a phrase in England. I don't know if Steady Eddie is a phrase that's made it over to the States as well.
I know that one.
Yeah, you guys use Jag a lot, don't you? Just a guy. That's who Shipley is to me. Like, he's not going to bust. I mean, I say that pretty confidently. He's produced for 3 straight years, a big program. Like, he knows how to play. He's a perfectly fine player. I just think he's an adequate player, pretty much. Like, if you squint, and PFF Sam made this comparison, if you really squint, you can see a little bit of Christian McCaffrey, and maybe like Christian McCaffrey's left toe. You can just about see a bit of him in there. You can see like he can do everything. He can do a little bit of everything. I just don't think he does anything well. I think that's exactly how I explained him in my pre-draft summary. Like, he can catch the ball at the backfield. He can hang on. He excels. I might think his best thing is in the screen game, like out in space. I think his short area speed and elusiveness in tight spaces is his like probably like, if you look at the trait that's going to allow him to win, like really quick feet. I think he's more of a scheme fit than a talent, if that makes sense. And I think the Eagles drafted him specifically to run a lot of outside zone this year, which I've just got a feeling the Eagles are going to sort of change their running game quite a lot this year under Kellen. And I think outside zone is going to be a big deal. And I think Shipley understands the zone running scheme really, really well. Everything else is just fine. Like, fine blocker. I actually think his blocking's, I've seen a lot of people say, like, the Eagles have finally got a blocker. And I'm not sure his pass protection's as good as some people think. But he's fine. Again, like, fine contact balance, average speed. He tested far better than he plays. The testing's a little bit odd to me. We might talk about that when we get to the weaknesses. But yeah, just does like everything fine. Like, if you want a guy that can come in for a few games, and if he has to start a couple with the Eagles offensive line, he can keep things going. But I don't think he does anything that wows you. I don't really have any other clips, Shane, except the ones you've got on your film thread that really stand out. So should we start with the outside?
Yeah, let's do it.
I think the Eagles will really like him. Yeah, no, it's fine.
Okay.
You talk about these clips first, and I'll add. But I know outside zone is the big one for me. Like the more you watch Shipley's film, the more you just see outside zone runs over and over again. So talk to me about what you like from this one here.
Yeah, so your audio cut out for a second, by the way, so I thought you were done and started talking, and then it caught back up. So apologies if there's any audio difficulties out here. But yeah, one of the biggest things with Will Shipley, and where I think he's a good fit, and Jonny talked about it in his article, is he's got good vision, especially on outside zone runs. He's a quick accelerator. I wouldn't say he doesn't have breakaway speed, but he can stick his foot in the ground and make tight cuts to get upfield. And so there's 2 clips here of him running outside zone. And on outside zone, you're basically reading from the C gap to the A gap. So again, for those of you that don't know, I guess it's not numbering, if we letter the gaps from the inside out, from the center to the guard is the A gap, between the guard and the tackle is the B gap, outside the tackle is the C gap. And so on outside zone, you're taking the handoff and you read from outside in. And so you read first the C gap. If it's open, we're going to get there. If it's not, we go to the B gap. And if it's not open, we go to the A gap. And we're just looking for a place to cut this upfield. And I think it's what Shipley does really well. And so you can see, you're letting this guy come because we're trying to get outside. But if we look at this, if we read this back out, there's not a C gap that we can really hit. There's not a B gap we can really hit, but there's room here in the A gap. And so you're going to see Shipley get outside that guy and cut it back inside. And I just think that's such a good rep here from him. We'll watch it one more time. There's a second one here as well, but he just does a really good job of slow playing this to the outside. And then he sticks his foot in the ground and gets upfield. And then the second time, just you guys that are watching at home, watch this full speed and tell me where you would make the cut, and then realize you're doing it from a view that's backed off here, and you're not worried about getting hit. But I think Shipley just does a good job of sticking his foot in the ground, getting back upfield, and looking for a cutback lane. And so, you mentioned that Kellen Moore likes to run a lot of outside zone, and I think that's where Shipley was at his best. And so when we talk about this being a good scheme fit, maybe not the most talented guy, I do think he does fit pretty well with what the Eagles are going to look to have him do.
Yeah, I know people are listening to a Brit talk about this who you probably imagine hasn't played the game. And football over here, I've coached a tiny bit in the UK, and when you watch clips like that, it's sometimes easy to pause the video and go, look at the C gap, that is hard. Like, that is really hard. And you can watch a lot of college guys that can't do that, and I'll give Shipley huge credit for that. That first one in particular, I think, is really, really nice. And for those of you wondering, or maybe don't know as much about the sort of run game, the difference between, let's say, a gap scheme run is that you don't really have to read it out. A gap scheme run basically does what it says on the tin. It aims to hit a certain gap. So you might design, and we talk about gap scheme, things like counter or power, where basically you're following a lead blocker, a little bit more old school in some ways, the power run game. And that almost takes away some of the awareness that you need as a running back with the term scouts will use his vision. Shipley's really good at that. And that's why I said I don't worry about him busting. Like, you can get more explosive running backs that I like the look of, like Tyrone Tracy's, like, is it Garendo that the 49ers took? But they're nowhere near as developed as Shipley. Like, the positive part is really easy to see from Shipley. You don't have to squint. Just watch him run outside zone. And outside zone is more than just a run play. And we're not going to talk about it now because we're going to save it for an off-season pod. But I'm really interested at the moment in the sort of like the blurring of the lines in the current NFL between the run and the pass game. And outside zone has been so popular for years because when you get defenses on the move, you essentially get them flowing. And the way of stopping outside zone is by really quickly flowing in the direction of outside zone. So guess what every good team does? They run play action and they run the opposite way. And we see this as a Shanahan staple going back a long time. And it's something the Eagles haven't really done a lot. And that's why I think Kellen Moore is going to bring it this year, because he has done it a lot. Saquon Barkley is a really good outside zone runner. And Will Shipley is as well. So I think I always think the draft gives you a little idea on what schematic trends you might see from your own team this year as well. And I think it's interesting that they drafted a guy who quite clearly excels in the zone run game. I think that's pretty much all I've got clips-wise, Shane. So if I talk a little bit about weaknesses and why I didn't like him as much.
Before you do that, let me show one more clip.
Go for it. If you got one more, do it.
Yeah, this is one. I think he's really good with like his rush plan and what he wants to do. Watch the way that he manipulates the linebacker here.
Yep, sorry, I knew we had this clip. I'm an idiot because you showed 2 and 1 in the first one. There we go.
Yeah, so watch number 31. I assume this is a linebacker. Maybe it's a safety that's just playing in the box. But Shipley is going to sort of fake this cutback to get 31 to commit, and then he's going to get this ball back up inside. And so the way he manipulates this guy out of position is just really good. And then, of course, cutting in the open field makes two guys miss. And that's sort of what you get with Shipley. He doesn't have that breakaway speed, but I think he's got good vision for the game, and he's got a good rush plan. And he's slippery. He goes down pretty easy once you grab him, but he's a little hard to get hands on. And so I just thought that was a really cool clip, especially how he manipulates that linebacker before he even gets to the hole.
Yeah, that's an awesome run. That's like a really, really high level run, as you sort of stole one of the negatives away from me slightly, which is what you'd love there is for him to turn that into an 80-yard touchdown or something, which is where someone like Saquon Barkley does. But in the reality, in the NFL, you don't get a bunch of huge run plays anyway. Before I go on to the negatives, Shane, we got a comment from Anthony talking about Shipley in the pass game. Yeah, absolutely. So really like a very, very good route runner. Issue I have with him in the pass game is, number one, if you want to play in the pass game, you have to be able to block. And I still think he's got some issues in pass protection. And quite simply, I think Kellen Moore has proven that if you're going to bring an extra man, he'll leave his running back into block. We spoke about that when we did the Kellen Moore podcast, and I wrote about him in depth. So if you want to catch the ball, you've got to be able to block in this offense. And he did have some problems with drops.
Yes.
I think he's like a natural, like when you talk about running backs these days, there's a difference. To me, he's a running back. Like some running backs are the blur the lines between running backs and receivers. He is very much a running back. He is a catching the ball. He doesn't look like, say, Christian McCaffrey, who looks like a wide receiver when he catches the ball. He does have a couple of like inconsistent drops that you wish he didn't have, and I'm not going to talk like coaching points, but I think he doesn't look like it's natural to me. It looks like he's like almost concentrating too hard when catching the ball. So as a weapon, very much used, because he's really good in tight spaces. So he's really good in the screen game. So he will be absolutely used in the Eagles passing game if he can get on the field, because that's a big skill of his. But just get a little bit prepared for a couple of drops. The other issues I had with Shipley, just very quickly, were fumbles. I put this in the overall, but unless you're like Saquon Barkley level good, you can't fumble. Like if you're a backup running back and you're not on the field very much, you simply cannot put the ball down, because coaches just won't bother playing you. Like there is nothing that will end a backup running back's career quicker than fumbles. It's like if you're a star receiver, we can live with drops. If you're not a very good receiver, we can't accept drops because you're barely open. He had 4 fumbles this year, I think 8 the past few years. Without being mean, that just can't happen. Like, as I said, you don't want anyone to fumble, but if your star players fumble, you can accept it, because the sort of the positives outweigh the negatives. If you're just an average rotational back, you can't do that. Like, can you imagine if Kenny Gainwell last year or Boston Scott were consistently fumbling, but they wouldn't be in the game. Somebody else would take their place. So fumble better, like a bit of a boring thing to talk about. We don't need to show any clips of it. The stats back that up. Drops, a little bit smaller for a like traditional feature back. So I think he's more of a running back 2, running back 3, but again, going in the 4th round isn't a problem. The reason why I think he went in the 4th, because he's got better film. Like I think he's a better natural runner than some of the guys that went ahead of him in this class, is the lack of explosive speed. I think Tommy Lawler at Lawler NFL tweeted this out, and I've got it in the article. At Clemson, he was there for 3 years. He had 1 play that went for more than 50 yards. Now, that's not everything. Big plays are not the be-all and end-all of being a running back, and how many 50-yard runs do you really get in the NFL? Not many. But in terms of like receiving and rushing, normally you expect like really good running backs to have quite a few explosive plays in college, because the field's wider. You do get more sort of, let's be honest, more points, I think, in general when you're doing it in the NFL. So 1 play of 50-plus yards is a little bit concerning. So I know there's a comment here which people are going to talk to me about how he tested in the 40. Again, sometimes testing doesn't match.
His testing was also a 4.45. The comment asked if Shipley didn't Shipley run a 4.3. Said Shady ran a 4.45, and he broke away quite a bit in his career. I think there's 2 things there. I mean, Shipley ran a 4.45, but a 4.45 when Shady played is not the same as a 4.45 now. If you do draft stuff and you go look at like relative athletic scores, it's almost jarring when you see a defensive player that isn't above an 8.0 relative athletic score, because defenses are getting smaller and faster, so is offense. So that's one part of it. It's a bit of a different era, even though it's the same generation. We watch Shady, we're going to watch Shipley, but the athletic testing isn't always indicative of how they play. And you have guys where their testing doesn't match their tape all the time. And I think that's the case for Shipley. There's no doubt that his long speed just isn't quite there. And, we could show some plays. I had one that I left on the cutting floor, but there was one where it absolutely should have been a touchdown and he gets run down from behind. And you see that on the tape from Shipley.
Yeah, Shane, I've got that in my article, by the way, while I'm talking, if you want to quickly grab it just to show it. But yeah, no, it's a fair comment. The testing is, you'd think he would be better, but I'm telling you, we're not making up things. Number one, watch the tape, and he doesn't. Breakaway plays, the stats back that up. As I said, one play above 50 yards. He just didn't do it, and he didn't look like he had another gear. The other thing about RAS testing, or RAS testing, whatever you want to call it, as you've said, they're normally above 8 these days because of how much they prepare for this. He was ranked, if you want to look at 927 in the 40, 808 in the 20 yards. So he got quicker as time went on. But how many runs do you get in NFL where you get sort of 20 yards to get going? So he didn't explode away immediately. You've got the clip on the screen for anyone watching. I did see someone reply to me telling me he sort of stumbles, which is why he doesn't fully go. And I get that, but he's up to speed and it's not there. And it's not, again, it's a really good run. It's a very useful play. In fact, I wonder if that is the 50-yard play that, does he break 50? No, he doesn't, does he? He's slightly shorter because he starts on the 40 and I think he's tackled around the 20. He says.
No, that's the 50-yard play.
Oh yeah, it might be just or thereabouts. So that is, you can see there the breakaway if you're watching on YouTube. If you're not, check the Bleeding Green article out and it's on there. But to be honest, it's not a rocket science play to break down. He just can't do it. Last comment, then we'll move on from Shipley. Overall, this year I do not expect him to be ahead of Kenny Gainwell. I think Kenny Gainwell's a better player than people give him credit for. I think people get frustrated with him because they were fascinated by Swift and Penny last year and he was taking snaps off them. I think he will eventually probably take his place as a running back 2 if he can deal with his drops and his fumbles. But I think he's probably more a running back 3 maybe this year, maybe towards the end of the year. I think the only thing he has in his favour is that I haven't seen Kenny Gainwell run outside zone much. And if Kenny Gainwell can't do that, then I think it's possible that Shipley immediately becomes the running back 2. But I'm not, if I was a fantasy guy, I wouldn't really be rushing to pick him up if Barkley does go down for a game personally. How about you, Shane?
Yeah, same. Kenny Gainwell's a better pass blocker, and I think that's going to be the bread and butter. He's a better pass blocker, and he doesn't have the drop issues that Will Shipley has at times. And so I think there's going to be a earning the trust thing. We mentioned the fumbles. You can't have the negative plays. You got to earn the trust of your coaching staff. And I think the big places you get negative plays is allowing sacks, fumbling the ball, and dropping the ball when we bring it to you on checkdowns. And I think Shipley will do all 3 of those things at a higher rate than Gainwell. So I don't expect him to be running back 2 to start the year. I think he'll get on the field. And I think, we also didn't mention he's a good kick returner. And so you might see him on special teams. I think he's going to be a game day active for sure, but I would expect Gainwell to outsnap him at least early in the year.